He was a disciplined German soldier, defeated and delivered to the Central Valley of California, expecting the absolute cruelty promised by wartime propaganda. Yet, when his captors put a tool in his hand, it wasn't a chain or a whip, but a sharp pruning knife, and they proceeded to pay him for his labor in American cash. The railcar had become a black box of dust, heat, and fear, a rolling steel prison that had swallowed 28-year-old Conrad Voss near the shores of North Africa, and was now delivering him to the rumored American hellscape. For weeks, the rattle of the tracks and the suffocating darkness had been soundtracked only by the whispered warnings from his fellow Africa Corps prisoners. Conrad braced himself for the crack of whips and the glare of endless barren sand. But when the doors finally slid open with a screech of rusted iron, what hit him was not the scorching emptiness he expected, but a shock of scent that was overwhelmingly, impossibly sweet and ripe. He blinked hard against the sudden blinding Central Valley sun. The air was thick with the aroma of blossoming citrus and heavy, bruised peaches. It was the scent of forgotten summer and unimaginable peacetime luxury. He had expected a prison camp to be set in a barren, punitive location. Instead, they were standing on a short, dusty siding surrounded by a vibrant, irrigated paradise. Row upon row of squat, heavily laden peach trees stretched toward the horizon, their branches bowed low under a burden of fruit. This was not the dry, merciless desert of propaganda. This was an orchard, an entire valley bursting with life. As they stumbled out, stiff and weary, the fear was briefly superseded by a profound confusion. His eyes swept across the immediate surroundings of the newly erected camp. The compound itself was a standard Army-issue rows of simple wooden barracks and a mess hall. The perimeter was marked by a wire fence, thin, almost symbolic, meant for livestock, not determined men. Beyond it lay the lush, deep green of the valley floor, the soil so dark and rich it seemed to breathe life. A figure approached them, but it was not the stern, polished American officer Conrad had imagined. The man wore denim, a sun-faded shirt, and a wide, cracked leather belt. Dust covered his boots. He looked pragmatic, weathered, and utterly civilian. This was Mr. Silva, a local farmer put in charge of the labor detail. Mr. Silva nodded once, a gesture of weary acknowledgement. He spoke a quick string of English to a nervous-looking interpreter. The message, delivered haltingly in German, added another layer to Conrad's confusion. They were not to be immediately humiliated or interrogated. Their first order was to line up for a meal and prepare for an inspection, after which they would be put to work in the adjacent fields. The whole process lacked malice. It was coldly efficient, operating with the casual confidence of a nation too busy growing food to dedicate energy to unnecessary hatred. Conrad watched as the sun began to dip, painting the clouds above the Sierra Nevada. The terrible, slow-dawning realization that everything he had been taught about his enemy might be a fundamental lie was already gnawing at him. The battle for his mind, he realized, was only just beginning. The first morning was not signaled by the blare of a whistle, but by the distant, rhythmic clang of a tractor starting up, a sound that spoke of commerce, not conflict. The men of the Africa Corps awoke to a confusion that was rapidly becoming the defining feature of their American captivity. They were led out by Mr. Silva, the civilian farmer, and two older military police officers who leaned on their rifles with boredom. Mr. Silva pointed to the rows of heavily laden peach trees and gave an order more confusing than any command on the battlefield. "Pick," the interpreter translated, gesturing to the fruit. "Fill the baskets. Do not bruise the fruit." The simplicity of the task felt like a deliberate insult. Conrad expected to be forced into building trenches. Instead, he was asked to gently harvest the bounty of the land. The men worked under the blazing California sun, their stiff khakis darkening with sweat and the sticky juice of the fruit. Conrad, driven by military discipline, worked with fierce efficiency. He was waiting for the inevitable moment of punishment, the guard who would find fault, the shouting that would begin, or the quota he would surely fail to meet. They were all waiting for the trap to spring, for the mask of kindness to drop and reveal the cruelty beneath. Hours bled into the afternoon. Baskets accumulated into piles of soft, fragrant gold. The three overseers remained quietly watchful but distant. There were no shouts, no insults. Once, when a young soldier named Hans dropped an entire basket, Conrad braced for the worst. Instead, Mr. Silva simply knelt, picked up a few pieces of unbroken fruit, and shrugged. "Waste is a pity," he said through the interpreter, "but start again." The lack of malice was deeply disorienting. It chipped away at the ingrained framework of the Reich's propaganda. By the time the call came to stop, the men were exhausted, covered in dust, and psychologically worn down by the sheer absence of expected brutality. They lined up in the twilight, anticipating the official reckoning. Mr. Silva walked slowly down the line, handing each man a small slip of thick, cheap paper. "This is a wage sheet," he said, using a thick accent. 80 cents a day in scrip. You worked, you got paid. That's the law." Conrad stared at the slip, not a punishment report, but a proof of civilian currency. It promised a wage, a form of dignity he hadn't possessed since his capture. This strange, small payment was a profound, confusing test of his indoctrinated beliefs. The truth of this story, born in the ashes of war, shows us the enduring power of simple human dignity. If you were surprised by the real history behind the headlines, hit the like button below and subscribe to join our community as we continue to uncover the most surprising and heartwarming moments of the past. Back in the barracks, the crumpled wage sheets lay on the bunks like counterfeit money, small slips of paper that carried the impossible promise of freedom of choice. The prisoners were immediately suspicious. They clustered in low, urgent groups, whispering that it was a trap. Conrad Voss sat on the edge of his cot, turning the slip over in his palm. He felt a deep-seated revulsion toward the money. All his life, he had been taught that Americans were a nation of criminals who lived only for money. Why would they now, in a moment of utter domination, offer a defeated enemy the very thing they cherished most? It felt like a humiliating joke. The interpreter, Wilhelm, was summoned to explain. He told them the United States Army followed the Geneva Conventions, which mandated payment for labor performed by prisoners. More importantly, he relayed Mr. Silva's simple economic explanation. "We have a labor shortage. The fruit cannot wait. You work, you get paid. That's the law." The simple, unapologetic practicality of this payment system was the most confusing aspect of their captivity. It stripped their defeat of its personal weight. This realization was profoundly disorienting. It contrasted the humiliation they felt with the sudden, undeniable dignity of being paid for their work. The following evening, the small camp canteen opened. Inside, the men found not the meager rations they expected, but simple items: coffee, cigarettes, postage stamps, and bars of American soap. Conrad watched as a few bold men spent their first 80 cents. The atmosphere was thick with anxiety, but nothing happened. Conrad waited until the crowd thinned. He approached the counter and, with a tremor in his hand, placed his scrip on the counter. He bought a single bar of American soap. It smelled strongly of citrus and clean oil, a scent so fresh it felt like a small, private luxury. He took the purchase back to his bunk, holding the small receipt in his hand. The paper was proof that he had exerted energy, produced value, and received payment. It was the moment he realized that the enemy, by giving him currency, had also given him back a fragment of his humanity. The war was lost, but perhaps the man was not. The men had already faced the moral shock of their pay, but the sensory shock of American abundance was an immediate attack on their deepest held beliefs about the enemy. The meal in the mess hall was a confrontation with an utterly unbelievable reality. Dinner was not the thin, watery soup and meager bread ration that German soldiers had grown accustomed to. Instead, the prisoners were served generous helpings of food that spoke of effortless, casual abundance. There was fresh bread, substantial cuts of beef and potatoes, cooked vegetables, and most shocking of all, a sweet dessert. The entire meal was designed to provide 3,200 calories a day, mandated by the Geneva Conventions, but executed with American excess. Conrad ate slowly, watching his fellow prisoners. The silence was the silence of men grappling with a moral impossibility. The men had been told for years that America was failing, yet here, in a remote Central Valley prison camp, they were being fed with a quality that surpassed the diet of a civilian in Germany. The moral weight of the meal was immense. The enemy fed its prisoners better than his homeland fed its loyal citizens. The emotional climax arrived not with the main course, but with the dessert, a small dish of ice cream made with real sugar. For a generation that had known nothing but strict rationing, the creamy cold sweetness was an experience that bordered on the surreal. It was a tangible, undeniable symbol of a nation's effortless, productive power. Conrad pushed the dish away, unable to finish it. He felt a sudden, profound sorrow for the depth of the deception he had lived under. The ease of this abundance was a more powerful argument against the Reich than any artillery barrage. They had fought a war against a nation whose industrial engine could also provide luxury desserts to its captives. It was the moment the scale of their misunderstanding became terrifyingly clear. He realized then that the fight was a fundamental conflict between scarcity and plenty, between a regime built on fear and a nation so confident it could afford simple human decency. He put down his spoon, the sweet taste of the frozen dessert, a bewildering final note in a day that had shattered years of conditioning. What would be the first true luxury item you would seek out after years of intense rationing? Let me know in the comments below. Conrad wrote home knowing the single, impossible truth he had to hide would shatter his family's reality. Writing home was a lesson in self-censorship, a moral and strategic challenge. How could Conrad possibly explain to a mother enduring Allied bombing raids and living under the iron hand of the ration card system that her son was receiving a daily wage and eating fresh melon every morning? The camp regulations allowed for 1 letter per month. The words would be inspected and stamped by American censors. For Conrad, the blank page was a confrontation with the two irreconcilable realities he now occupied. If he wrote the truth, his mother would surely think he had gone mad. The propaganda machine back home had assured everyone that captured German soldiers were starved and beaten. A letter describing 3,200 calories of food and a cash wage would not be believed. It would only cause alarm. He began, his pencil tracing the careful script of a dutiful son. Dearest mother, I am well and healthy. The journey was long, but I am in a safe place now, working hard under a great sun. He wrote about the warm days, the wide blue Californian sky, and the odd, simple, clean work of harvesting the peaches. He carefully described the landscape, focusing on the impressive American organization, abstract details that spoke to power without revealing luxury. But he had to omit the essential truths. He could not write about the script in his pocket, the sweet scent of his new citrus soap, or the ice cream. He made his condition sound tolerable, but poor, using vague language that suggested necessity and basic survival, not the shocking generosity they were experiencing. He saw this as a necessary lie, a way to shield his family from the unbelievable reality of American prosperity. Meanwhile, in the camp office, the American censoring officer received Conrad's letter alongside hundreds of others. He sat surrounded by evidence of the surreal nature of his country's wartime experience. The officers would occasionally share these censored letters, chuckling faintly at the polite fictions the prisoners invented. They knew that the families back in Europe would never believe the stories of friendly treatment. The officer knew, too, that the prisoners' censored correspondence was, in its own way, an act of protection. The propaganda that had once been a weapon against the enemy had become a fragile shield for the families at home. By omitting the truth of his comfort, Conrad was protecting his mother from the unbearable paradox of his existence. As the officer stamped the letter with his approval for sending, he was tacitly approving the soldier's choice to maintain his family's hope. The written lie was, ironically, the truth they needed to survive. The Central Valley's seasonal switch brought the German prisoners deeper into the vineyards, where the grapes hung heavy and purple. The change of task brought a new and more profound test of American trust. They were now given tools that could easily be weapons. The work required precision and, unexpectedly, the use of sharp pruning knives. For men raised in a military culture, the casual handing over of such implements was startling. Conrad Voss looked at the keen blade of his knife. He expected the guards to multiply, watching their every move with heightened suspicion. But the supervision remained the same. Mr. Silva and his quiet demeanor, with only 2 bored military police officers nearby. This was not a system built on total control, but on a terrifying, disarming assumption of compliance. The work itself was quiet and meticulous. The men learned to clip the stems with care. This delicate handling of the fruit served as a constant, subtle metaphor for the delicate, unusual handling of the prisoners themselves. They were treated not as volatile captives, but as temporary, necessary laborers. The absence of fear in the American farmers was more unnerving to Conrad than any threat. One blistering afternoon, a younger, hot-headed prisoner named Fritz, frustrated by the heat, slipped. The blade of his pruning knife snapped. Every man froze, anticipating the immediate, harsh, and public punishment that was the inevitable consequence of destroying military property back home. Fritz turned pale, bracing for the worst. Conrad watched as Mr. Silva slowly approached. He inspected the broken tool, then looked at Fritz, not with fury, but with a tired understanding. "Accidents happen when you work," the farmer stated simply through the interpreter. He pulled a small notebook from his pocket, made a brief notation, and handed Fritz a slightly older, duller knife. "Be more careful. Note the broken knife for repair." There was no shouting, no public shaming. The entire incident was treated as a logistical problem, not a moral failure. The quiet refusal of Mr. Silva to react with malice was the final, devastating blow to Conrad's military conditioning. The concept of justice he knew was built on vengeance. The American version was built on pragmatism and an almost baffling capacity for forgiveness. The broken knife and the lack of reprisal demonstrated that the line between us and them was defined by a simple, shared understanding of what it meant to work. That small, everyday moment shattered years of ingrained hate and replaced it with gratitude. This unexpected fairness solidified the central paradox of their captivity. They had been defeated by a nation whose strength lay not in its capacity for brutality, but in its self-assured decency. The highest wall around them was not the barbed wire, but the psychological boundary of their own conscience. They were trusted, and that trust was more binding than any chain. If you found this story of unexpected human decency in wartime compelling, share it with someone who needs to hear how simple human fairness can overcome years of propaganda. On a rare, sun-drenched afternoon, a few of the men were allowed to ride in the back of a canvas-covered pickup truck into the nearest small town to help unload supplies. This was not a trip of escape, but a confrontation with the sudden, final truth about the true scale of their enemy. As the truck rattled away from the compound, the prisoners were quiet, their eyes wide and nervous beneath the canvas. Conrad Voss expected to see armed patrols and evidence of the scarcity he knew must define America's war effort. Instead, as the truck slowed, the canvas flap was briefly pulled back, and the scale of the difference between propaganda and reality hit him with the force of a physical blow. The towns in Europe he remembered were gray, pockmarked, and hollowed out by rationing and air raids. This small Central Valley town, called Sanger, was pristine, a quiet monument to a prosperity he could not comprehend. Civilian women casually drove their own cars down streets that had no visible damage. The buildings were intact. The air was filled with the low, pleasant sounds of commerce and everyday life. They stopped at a store. Inside, Conrad saw shelves stacked impossibly high with packaged food and necessities. There was no rationing here. He saw an endless supply of canned goods, white sugar by the sack, and bread wrapped in plastic. The sheer volume of material wealth was a terrifying revelation. It was the abundance of a nation that could prosecute the largest conflict in human history without sacrificing the comfort of its most remote citizens. The most unsettling sight was at the nearby gas station. Cars lined up to fill their tanks from pumps that seemed to deliver gasoline ceaselessly. The Reich had built its war machine on desperate energy conquest. Yet here, the fuel seemed to flow effortlessly, a casual, endless supply that mocked the German belief in its own industrial superiority. In that moment, Conrad realized that the empire they had fought was not the fragile, corrupt entity depicted in their posters. It was an engine of production so vast, so efficient, that its effortless prosperity became its most effective weapon. The true power of the enemy lay in the casual, stunning efficiency of their daily lives. The scale of the war against them suddenly became clear. He was a prisoner, but he was also a witness to a reality that completely undermined years of indoctrination. The vision of that small, ordinary town shattered the final vestiges of the propaganda that had fed his loyalty. The only restraint was the moral understanding that the American system was simply too massive, too self-assured to be brought down by a few desperate, defeated men. Conrad understood. He was fighting a war he could not possibly have won. He had been saving his script for months, tucking the small slips of paper into a repurposed tobacco tin, not out of greed, but out of a deep-seated, desperate need to reclaim something he had lost: the power of choice. For years, the military system had commanded every aspect of Conrad's existence. But here, the small wage offered him an unimaginable liberty. His purpose was not frivolous. He thought constantly of his younger sister, Erica. He wanted to send her something real, a tangible piece of proof that he was alive and still capable of a gesture of care. He knew the war had stripped away the simple joys of childhood. His accumulated 80-cent payments now amounted to a small fortune. The day he chose was a Saturday, the routine day for visiting the camp canteen. He approached the counter, the tin heavy in his hand. The simple wooden toy he had seen weeks earlier was still there. A small horse, carved by one of the older, quieter German prisoners. It felt smooth and good in his hand. He placed his script on the counter. The American corporal counted the money before sliding the small carved horse across the worn wood. The act of paying for it, the small receipt, and the weight of the wooden toy in his hand represented an act of agency he hadn't known since his capture. He was no longer just a prisoner, but a man who had earned something and used that earning to express affection across an ocean of conflict. That evening, he carefully wrapped the horse in a piece of clean cloth. He took his time writing the accompanying note. He told Erica he had made a new friend who helped him carve it, carefully perpetrating the small deception that allowed him to express his affection. The final detail was the inclusion of a small, bright piece of American candy, a hard peppermint he had also purchased, a tiny, colorful testament to the nation's endless sugar supply. This was the moral climax of his captivity. He realized that the greatest freedom was not found in escaping the wire, but in the power to choose kindness over bitterness. The Central Valley had given him back his dignity by demanding honest work and offering fair pay. In a world defined by the brutality of war, the greatest act of defiance was this small, simple gift. He was sending a piece of this bewildering America home, transforming the currency of his defeat into a small seed of peace. April of 1945. The peach blossoms were falling like pink snow across the Central Valley. The German news reports had been hinting at collapse, but the final, undeniable confirmation of the end of the conflict came quietly over a small radio in Mr. Silva's dusty office. Conrad Voss and his fellow prisoners were in the vineyard when the interpreter arrived. The man simply stood at the edge of the row, his voice barely above a murmur. The fighting in Europe had ceased. Germany had surrendered. The war was over. For a moment, the silence was absolute. The announcement was met with a mix of stunned silence, profound relief, and deep, consuming sorrow. Years of loyalty had been tied to a cause that in an instant simply vaporized. The men stood motionless, suddenly and terribly alone. The feelings of guilt for the distant family and sorrow for a lost homeland now gripped them. The contrast with the American reaction was immediate. There was no gloating. Mr. Silva appeared shortly after. Removing his hat, he spoke to the men as a solemn witness. "It's over now," he said, his voice quiet. "You all worked hard. It's time for you to go home." In the days that followed, the American military trucks arrived to process the prisoners for repatriation. As the men packed their belongings, they realized they were preparing to leave a place that had shown them more material comfort and emotional dignity than the land they were returning to. Mr. Silva approached Conrad as he was counting his final wages. The farmer extended his hand. "Thank you for your hard work, son. Go home safe." Conrad shook the man's hand. "We will not forget your kindness, Mr. Silva," he managed to say. We were taught to expect something different." The farmer shrugged, a final gesture of decency. "No sense fighting ghosts, son. The fight's done. You were just men needing a job, and we were farmers needing hands." When the trucks finally rolled out, carrying the German prisoners away from the Central Valley, Conrad looked back. The Bai vineyard was already fading, but the image of the tall farmer standing by the wire was indelible. He knew he was leaving a part of himself behind, the bitter, indoctrinated soldier. He was leaving as someone who had glimpsed a different way of living, where dignity came from simple respect and the ability to earn one's keep. The greatest freedom he had found wasn't physical, it was moral, and it was paid for every day in scrip. Bremerhaven, in the winter of 1946, was a landscape of gray, bombed-out devastation and biting cold. The Central Valley sun felt like a beautiful, unbelievable dream that now collided with the terrible, jagged reality of a ruined homeland. As Conrad Voss stepped ashore from the troop transport ship, the frigid air cut through his thin clothes. The docks were rubble. He carried his meager belongings, but more importantly, he carried two unique, profound souvenirs: the small, smooth wooden horse and a deep, unsettling moral certainty. The memory of endless American gasoline and food made the devastation around him feel twice as absolute. American officers handed them small care packages before they disembarked: chocolate bars, canned food, and pamphlets. The sight of the American Red Cross logo on every box was both surreal and deeply humbling. For years, he had been taught that Americans were a materialistic, cruel, and honorless people. Now, holding a bar of American chocolate, Conrad felt the foundation of that lie crumble completely. His homecoming was to a home that barely existed. His town was severely damaged. He had to use a small amount of American currency to find basic shelter and food. But in the ashes of the destruction, he carried something the ruins could not erase, an idea he had learned under the Central Valley sun. He knew that strength was not domination, it was organization and the confident ability to uphold a simple promise. Conrad began working for the Allied occupation forces as a translator and logistical aide. His rough English was full of odd American slang and simple, direct honesty. He became known for his tireless energy and practical understanding of efficiency. When American officers expressed surprise at his resilience, he would tell them quiet stories of the Central Valley, of the peaches, the endless gasoline, and the day Mr. Silva simply noted a broken tool for repair. He spoke the human truth. The Americans had treated their enemies with dignity and fairness. This astonished many occupation soldiers who expected to hear tales of hardship. These shared memories became the first human bridges between the former enemies. In time, Conrad used his acquired knowledge of American farming logistics and distribution to help his community rebuild. He understood that the secret to American abundance was clear, rational planning and a respect for labor. He helped organize local farmers, applying the principles he had learned in the Central Valley, transforming the currency of his defeat into a tool for reconstruction. He eventually opened a small cooperative near Stuttgart. Above his humble desk, he kept the small, hand-carved wooden horse. When people asked him about it, he would simply say, "It reminds me of the most important lesson of the war." Conrad Voss never became rich, but he lived a life defined by quiet purpose and moral certainty. He was a living symbol that the greatest defeat he had suffered had led to his most profound victory: the discovery that dignity and fairness are the real sources of power, not the violence of the state. He taught others that the American enemy had won not through cruelty, but through a confident decency. And sometimes, the greatest contribution a defeated soldier can make to his homeland is to return not with vengeance, but with the quiet grace of a changed heart.